Professor Sunita Facknath. I'm a professor in sustainable agriculture and presently the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Mauritius. Mauritius, as you know, is a small island developing state, what we call a SIDS, and in that capacity it's highly vulnerable to climate change. It's very vulnerable to sea level rise. It's, the temperature is increasing like in many other parts of Africa. Rainfall is becoming very erratic. We have saltwater intrusion into the coastal regions. And of course, we are in the cyclonic belt. And the frequency and intensity of cyclones has increased tremendously in the past few years. We're having extreme events of drought and flash floods, which we didn't have ever before. Droughts, yes, perhaps, but flash floods is a new phenomenon for Mauritius. And yes, so we are really facing all the problems that SIDS are known to face in this context of changing climate. Mauritian agriculture is rather different from mainland African agriculture. We have heterogeneity in terms of the sizes of fields and the number of planters cultivating these fields. And on the other hand, we have homogeneity in terms of agricultural practices. For instance, if you take the sugar sector, 70% of the sugarcane cultivations are owned by a few large sugar estates. So also for fruits, a few large fruit orchards which are corporately run. And then we have something like 22,000 small planters that occupy the remaining 30% of sugarcane land, and similar figures for the non-sugar sector. In terms of the agronomic practices, there's a lot of similarity. In other words, very high inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, high dependence on mechanization. That is, of course, wherever the topography allows it, and whereas there is economy of scale. Because for small planters, mechanization, of course, is a bit more difficult. And we also have high energy input. Okay, agriculture in Mauritius is partly rain-fed, but largely irrigated, and that's for the large planters as well as for the small planters in the humid and subhumid areas. Agriculture is very highly impacted by climate change. All the climate change impacts, such as increasing temperatures, we have erratic rainfall, the saltwater intrusion. All of these are affecting agriculture in a number of ways. For instance, increasing temperature is changing the crop phenology. In other words, the fruiting and flowering periods of different crops are changing. So farmers have to then plant in different ways. They have to adjust their planting and harvesting dates. Rainfall has become erratic, so it's difficult for farmers to plan their crop cycle. Also, pests and diseases have increased tremendously. The salinity of the soil has increased in coastal regions. So overall, the impact on agriculture is quite significant. Adaptation measures have been developed as in other parts of Africa to actually address these challenges. For instance, with respect to the high amount of fertilizers that are used, and these are essentially nitrogenous fertilizers, and which, as we know, release a lot of greenhouse gases. Okay, there's greenhouse gas emission from nitrogenous fertilizers. So one of the adaptations is to reduce the fertilizer use and go more towards compost and other measures, such as mulching. Now, we're laying a lot of emphasis on mulching as a practice. So crop residues are spread out over the field, and it has multiple advantages. So one is, of course, the organic mulches. They break down and provide nutrients, which then helps to reduce fertilizer use. But more importantly, it keeps the soil cool. And with increasing temperatures, that's a very big advantage. I mean, that's really necessary. Also, with erratic rainfall and less rainfall, I should stress that we have lost something like 100 millimeters of rainfall in the past 50 years. So that's quite a drastic reduction. And one of the ways to then meet this challenge is to add this layer of mulch, which then maintains the soil moisture and keeps the soil cool and moist, and then crops can grow better. It also suppresses weeds. So it suppresses pests, some pests. It can, of course, lead to problems with other pests, like snails, for instance, but okay, those are relatively easy to combat. But weeds are suppressed, which is a major factor for us. And of course, as I said, the organic matter adds the nutrients to the soil. To address the issue of erratic rainfall and reduced rainfall, we encourage our planters to adopt what is called as a zai planting technique. Zai planting is where they plant in little pits, in little depressions. These fill up with actual morning dew, okay, which then condense and provide moisture. There's also a technique known as demi-lune, which literally means half moon. Okay, it's a French word, demi-lune. So half moon, again, is a similar approach. So the farmer makes these half moon shaped depressions in which they plant the seeds. And again, this approach is the principle is the same, that it gathers moisture and helps the crop to get the necessary moisture. Also, when we have heavy rainfall, the impact of the raindrops is much less when there is a coating of mulch. So those extreme events then help to reduce, mulching helps to reduce the erosion propensity of heavy rainfall. So mulching is a big, it's a measure that is being promoted in a big way, I should say. And then we also have other measures to reduce pests and diseases. I'll tell you something very interesting about Mauritius. In the sugar sector, in the sugarcane plantations, we don't use insecticides at all, because all the insect pests of sugarcane are controlled using what we call natural enemies, the biological control approach. And these have been introduced from other countries into Mauritius to control these pest insects, and it has worked beautifully. Interestingly, we do promote a number of techniques and measures that we encourage farmers to use. These are scientifically validated, developed in labs and on demonstration farms, in the Ministry of Agriculture and the Research Institute demonstration plots. And then we sort of encourage farmers to use that. We have awareness raising campaigns, demonstration sessions, and so on. But farmers are also very, very creative. Sometimes they take our recommendations and turn it around in a way that we never expected, or sometimes they add to that. And I'll give you one example of mulching. In all our experimental trials, and that also given by the ministry, we've used crop residues. Now, what farmers do, especially those that have animals, they need the crop residues to feed to the animals, so they're short of mulch material. So they started using textiles, which was something we ourselves never envisaged. So they use worn textiles, long pieces of cloth, okay, which they have maybe used for other purposes in the household, and then they're washed clean, and they're fairly sort of thin and threadbare, but they still do the job of a mulch fairly well. So, and this was something that we ourselves never envisaged. I mentioned about using traps, pheromone traps and food traps for fruit flies. And then we saw that instead of using the traps that we were recommending, they developed their own. For instance, they mix vinegar, okay, with something like sugar, brown sugar, okay, and that attracts fruit flies equally well as our scientifically validated traps. Or then they place a dish of stale beer on a flat surface, and that attracts snails. So the snails are actually attracted to the smell of stale beer, and then they drown in the beer. So an ideal climate-smart farm would be one that has a mixed cropping system with the different crops. It would have reduced use of fertilizers, okay? Ideally organic. If it's full organic farming, there would be no synthetic fertilizers. But in climate smart, we don't necessarily we don't equate it with organic. So there is, we do allow fertilizers and pesticide use, but in a reduced way. And then the soil fertility is built up in other ways. For instance, using compost, farmyard manure, mulch that I mentioned earlier on. So all of these build up, and we have to increase the amount of organisms in the soil, what we call the soil biota or soil biodiversity. Having more microorganisms and macroorganisms in the soil improves soil fertility and health, and that's what we have to encourage. So we have to have fertile soil, that is fertile not by addition of fertilizer, but a healthy soil. Reduce use of pesticides, so pests and diseases controlled using natural means or using other simple non-chemical means. Okay, a crop rotation approach where it's not the same crop being grown temporarily and spatially on the field. Okay, so crop rotation. Also using preferably renewable energy systems for the different practices. Okay, less dependence on sophisticated irrigated systems, and more in terms of natural systems, like I said, the zybe planting or the demi-lune, these kind of approaches for moisture. And of course, one of the main things is using climate-adapted varieties. And if you're talking of animals, then animal breeds. So drought-resistant varieties, indigenous varieties, okay? These would be sort of the right components of a climate-smart agriculture. So that would make the system resilient. It would be adapted to the local situation, very site-specific, and it would also help to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, which is, in fact, the whole crux of climate-smart agriculture. So it meets the three pillars of climate-smart agriculture, which is food security, adaptation, and mitigation.